for the welcome address. Hello. Hello.
Okay. Good morning, dear participants. Hearty welcome to Dr. Boopathi, the resource person of the day, my colleagues, other participants, and beloved students. You know, a virtual platform like this demands economy of time and curtailment of formal introductory speeches. But that should not prevent us from formally welcoming Dr. Boopathi, our resource person, to this national seminar organized by the Department of English, M.S.M College, Kayamkulam. In the very beginning, let me thank Dr. Boopathi for having positively responded to our invitation and having spared his valuable time with us today. Dr. Boopathi is an assistant professor at the Central University of Tamil Nadu. Going through your impressive biodata and your commitment to disability studies, I mean, a lot of achievements within a very short period of time. It is really impressive, Dr. Boopathi, and I'm sure you have a very fruitful academic career ahead. Congratulations to all your academic achievements. And I find it indeed fortunate that we have you with us today to deliver this talk on disability studies, a topic of very contemporary significance. A couple of weeks back, some of us, our faculty members, had attended an open defense of a PhD thesis on disability studies. And getting to know more about this area of research will certainly benefit us. As I told you, I'm not going further. On behalf of the management and the Department of English, I extend a warm welcome to you, sir. Hearty welcome to all other participants who have joined. Also, a word of appreciation to Jayalakshmi and Asha Balachandran, the coordinators, and the whole team behind this effort. Wish you all the best. Thank you.
Now, we all are waiting patiently for the presentation. Before that, let me introduce our resource person, Dr. Boopathi P. She is an assistant professor, Department of English Studies, School of Social Sciences and Humanities, Central University of Tamil Nadu. He is a young scholar with a high profile. He completed his PhD from Pondicherry University and PhD from English and Foreign Language University, Hyderabad, on Palestinian life narrative. His specializations include Palestinian literature, West Asian literature, disability studies, life writing studies, post-colonial and resistance literature. He is one of the very few scholars of disability studies in India to introduce a new interdisciplinary course titled Disability Studies and Literature for final year PG students of English and English language teaching at Al-Haj University, where he had worked as assistant professor for 3 years before he joined Central University, Tamil Nadu in 2019. He has presented a number of papers on various topics on national and international conferences and workshops. His research works have been published by renowned international publishers like Switzerland and Booklet and by many other reputed publishers. He is a member of the editorial review board of International Journal of Homeschooling, published by University Michigan Press, and also one of the members of the editorial board, the Dept, an international peer-reviewed online journal of language, literature, and critical theory. With these few words, let me invite Dr. Boopathi for the talk.
So good morning, everyone. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes,
am
sir.
I audible? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, especially online platform like this, we need to often confirm with others whether we are audible or not. Otherwise, we'll be talking to only ourselves. Okay. So at the outset, I thank M.S.M College, the principal, and the head of the department, Dr. Rubina ma'am, and coordinators of this webinar series, Ms. Jayalakshmi and Dr. Asha, and for having thought of me, as a right person to talk about disability studies. So thank you so much for that. And so as the head of the department, Dr. Rubina has already touched upon. It's a very, in India at least, it is a sort of emerging area, disability studies. But in the West, it has more than 4 decades of academic history. So the field has seen as much as 500 odd very groundbreaking publications spanning across all the disciplines of disability studies, cutting across various disciplines. It has become now the interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary paradigm, right? So talking about all this, sort of a paradigmatic shift the kind of discipline has gone through will be really an arduous task. So as I have given the title, so literary disability studies, from representation to representation. So let me just confine myself only to that particular topic, which is one of the very important subfields of disability studies. That is basically literary disability studies. In fact, that is a concern of all of us today because we are, we are actually in the Department of Literary Studies or in the Department of English Studies, right? So I've actually planned my talk today in 3 sections. So I'll be talking to you my talk on this topic in 3 phases. The first phase is basically orienting you with certain important keywords in disability studies that are in fact relevant for us to understand the literary disability studies. So that would be my first phase. I'll be walking you through certain key concepts that have radically changed our understanding of disability, particularly the representation of disability in literary writings throughout the history. And the second phase, what I would be doing is basically I'd be introducing you certain key texts that have emerged in the field of literary disability studies and their intervention to expand this field of literary disability studies. And also how they have enabled us with certain critical tools to understand the politics of disability representation in Western as well as Eastern literary and cultural traditions. So that would be my second phase of my talk. And the third phase obviously would be to expose you to certain writings by the disabled. In fact, it's a very huge field. Writing literature by the disabled, it's a very, very wide area. So, but then I'll be limiting to certain texts. I'll be introducing you certain texts and certain concepts, and of course the representation phase. Presentation phase, basically the self-representation phase of literature by the disabled. So this is basically the contour of my talk today. I'll try to finish it up within 45 to 1 hour as been told to me, and after that we'll break for interaction. Okay, so as I said, when we talk about disability studies, as I said earlier, it's a very, very wide area. It, in fact, started from the late 1970s. Some people say early 1970s. But for me, I basically consider the birth of disability studies from late 1970s onwards, especially the Union Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPS it is called. They came out with a manifesto that, in radically shifting the understanding of disability from medical model to social model. So I'm not going to go into that detail of it. That would actually take me to the another trajectory of sociological disability studies. But I will just sort of tell you what is the medical and social model of disability studies. That would actually help us understand the later part of my talk. So in fact, the late 1970s, disability was understood to be what we call a biological lack. It's a sort of a defect, certain amount of deformity. Okay? But this Union of Physical Impaired Against Segregation, a very important, very, very powerful organization by the disabled in UK, came out with a radical thesis on social model of disability. Right? So, which this sort of enabled us to look at disability not as a medical problem, not even as a personal tragedy, or not even as a sort of a charitable, a body that deserves a charitable attention, but as a social problem. Right? One is obviously one is obviously having an impairment, let's say blindness or physical impairment, but what is more important is how the impairment of an individual translates to become a social pathology. Right? So basically, they looked at the architectural problems and sociological issues, and above all, institutional ableism. Right? So basically, they said that they came out with certain understanding that the society is not accessible, the environment is not accessible, the architecture that they use to conceive the building has always sort of thought of people with able-bodiedness. So they problematized this thing. So they said that it is a social pathology, it's a social disease of, let's say, not accommodating people with disabilities. Right? Later, Mike Oliver, in his book, very famous book titled The Politics of Disablement, and another important book titled Understanding Disability. These two books, Mike Oliver was considered to be the first professor of disability studies in the world. So he expanded this thing and made it as a very important academic intervention. So this is the very, very inaugural concept of disability studies, that is basically shifting the focus of disability from individual medical and charity to right-based as well as socially concerned, right, model of disability. So that's a very important thing I want to make this point clear in the very beginning of my talk. So moving on to the key concepts. I'm going to talk about, or I'm going to limit myself only to 5 important key concepts. I'm aware of the fact that there are a number of key concepts. There is a book titled Keywords for Disability Studies, very popular book. It has 62 important keywords. So I'm going to limit myself only to 5 important keywords. Basically, looking at the concern as well as the pertinence of the lecture today. Right? So those 5 keywords are normalcy, ability, stigma, embodiment, and culture. So repeating again, it's normalcy, ability, stigma, embodiment, and culture. Okay. Let's just start with these 5 keywords are very, very important keywords. In fact, the first 3 keywords are the inaugural keywords of any sub-discipline of disability studies, whether you take educational disability studies, or you take cultural disability studies, or literary disability studies, or you take this psychological disability studies, or any disability studies for that matter. For the first 3 keywords very, very important, and the next two keywords that are embodiment and culture are particularly relevant for cultural disability studies as well as literary disability studies. So to start with, the first keyword, that is normalcy. Right? So again, the word normalcy has produced quite a number of literature, a lot of epistemology in the field of disability studies. I'm going to sort of only walk you through certain important intervention that has actually come from the scholars of disability studies to this important ideology called normalcy. Right? So, if you look at this kind of ideology, I basically consider these five keywords as five important ideologies. So whether we know or do not know, or knowingly or unknowingly, we have been subscribing to certain amount of corporeal normativity, biological normativity. In fact, the culture that we inherit or the culture in which we live, we are often exposed or we are often confirmed by others our existence based on certain normative ideologies. So I'm saying this because since time immemorial and even today, so in fact, this ideology of normativity increasingly theorized, let's say, in the in the second half of 20th century, especially with the arrival of stigma and especially by disability studies scholars and queer studies scholars, race studies scholars, and gender studies scholars, and all these things. But the ideology of normativity or normalcy, what it does is it tries to, one hand, differentiate certain bodies. On the other hand, it tries to exclude certain bodies. So, for example, according to the ideology of normativity, who can be best called as normal in the West is basically somebody who is male, to white male, sort of educated, young, healthy, able-bodied, heterosexual, and heteronormative middle-class person. Right? So look at this kind of the kind of a paradigm, some sort of a model with which the idea of normativity has been, looked at. So in India, preferably, it is basically a Brahmin male, a middle class, educated, young, heterosexual, heteronormal, right? And obviously able-bodied person, right? So except this sort of very, very minority amount of people, all the other people are excluded, are termed as either abnormal or dehumanized. Often they are dehumanized, right? In the case of disabled, it actually, happens in a very, very rampant manner. Every day, the kind of discourse that we use, the kind of deeds that we do, that often sort of discriminate disabled people, either by eliminating them from the public sphere, or by differentiating them, or by excluding them. Right. So this is, this sort of an what you call this normative presumption of imagining everybody to be normal, and in fact conceiving everybody as normal. So what happens is the appearance of, let's say, gay man, or the appearance of disabled, or the appearance of black person, or the appearance of Dalit, or the appearance of women, absolutely puts us into certain amount of what you call hesitant situation, as in how to interact with these people, especially particularly so in the case of disabled. Whenever we looked at the disabled, we often ask, how do you do this? How do you behave yourself? How do you read? How do you eat? So some amount of curiosity arises within us because we think there is a certain amount of division between able and disabled. Right? So with that, I'm moving on to the another segment of the idea of ability, because there are a lot of people have talked about idea of normalcy, especially Leonard Davids and Tonya Tiskowski, right? So especially, particularly before I move on to this ability, I just want to spend a minute or so on this idea of normalcy, as in how Leonard Davis has a very important person, somebody who has edited the Disability Studies Reader. Now it is fifth edition is available, right? So what he has said in his book title, Enforcing Normalcy. Right? So the book was published in 1995. So what he said in that book is basically disabled people are not excluded based on their biological difference, but they are excluded by juxtaposing them. The society is trying to juxtapose the disabled people with the normal people. So the ideology of normative culture excludes the disabled people, not the quote unquote normal people. Right. So all of us, in one or the other way, have internalized this ideology of normativity, and it's a very what you call it's a very bogus sort of theorization. I mean, the ideology of normativity itself, because it's a very fluid concept. Who is, I mean, somebody who is normal in one context will be absolutely abnormal in different contexts, right? So let's imagine the black people. When it comes to the disabled people, they are considered as normal beings. But when it comes to the white people, they are considered as abnormal beings, right? So same is the case with anything for that matter. For example, look at the LGBT people, look at women, right? So look at Dalit people, all of them, and transgender, quite a range of things. That's what I said, that the minority of the normal people, the normal, going by strict ideological framework, the normal people are very less in number, not even, let's say, 3%. But the rest of the 97% of human beings are aspiring to become a normal. So imagine the conception of a normativity or the normalcy itself is a very fluid, flawed, as well as a de facto one, right? Yeah. So going back to the term ability. Ability again talks about the it is the another side of the same coin, that is normal people, right? So ability talks about bodily, able-bodiedness, basically able-bodied people. So one side we have normal people, and on the other side, the normal people are considered to be able-bodied people, basically looking at the capacity of the body, right? So especially particularly the concept only refers to the disabled people. At least in the case of normal, we find that it refers to whole range of marginalized people. But in the case of the ability, only refers to this whole range of disabled people. It creates certain amount of dichotomy, a certain amount of polarity, right? That is able versus disabled, right? So it has a long history. Again, there is Fiona Kumari Campbell has written a very interesting book on ableism. I'm not going to go into the history because that will take another 1 or 2 hours for me to expand upon it. But I'll just sort of brief you how this ableism operates. Okay? So, like I said about the ideology of normativity, ableism also, operates within us without our consciousness. Right? It started in the late 19th century, or in the second half of 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution reached its peak. Right? When the labor of an individual was considered to be an important definitive framework to define who really qualified to be a human. Obviously, so whoever were not able to sell their labor, be it physical or mental labor, were considered as a disabled in the second half of 19th century. Right? So, and what the society did, so first it identified these people were not potentially able to sell their labor. Therefore, the society tried to basically exclude them in the asylums. Right? So then what happened is, those people who were institutionalized in the asylums, because the society did not want to take any responsibility of the disabled people. Especially in India also, you find a number of, especially particularly in the case of blind people, it is there in the colonial archives also. Aparna Nair, a very important historian, she has written a book titled Blindness in Colonial India, where she said that the colonial record says that there's a blind woman in Calcutta, she has donated some money to the government. So she is a beggar, right? So the colonial government considered begging is one of the professions of the disabled people. So that was the scenario in the late 19th century. So one side, disabled people were basically institutionalized, they were put in the warehouses. On the other side, they were left on the sort of society to roam freely, depending basically on the arms of the people, right? So that is the scenario in the 19th century. If you come down to the 20th century, the idea of ability, especially after two world wars, sort of increased to become a very, very dominant ideology in the second half of 20th century, and absolutely dominating the social, cultural, political, and economic realms of the Western countries as well as in the Eastern countries. So in the late especially in the beginning of 1990s, the ideology of ableism emerged as a very, very dominant ideology that absolutely excluded disabled people, stating that they were incapable, incapacitated, and above all, they were unable to do certain things. Right? So based on this premises, they were excluded from the government jobs. There's a whole range of disability rights movement thing. You can look at Jagdish Chandra's works. He has a very interesting PhD thesis, right? The movement of the organized blind in India, submitted to the Syracuse University in 2011, where he talks about, traces the entire history of disability rights movement in India, how they fought against this ideology of ableism, especially sort of developed by the Indian government itself, stating that the disabled people were not actually eligible for the job and so on and so forth. So this is the ideology of ableism operates. And moving on to the third important one is basically the idea of stigma, right? Stigma as a term was in fact, emerged term emerged from Erving Goffman, very famous founding sociologist, somebody from sociology will be able to recall. The book was published in 1963. The title of the book is Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity. Very important book, as one of the groundbreaking books of sociology, as well as what we call LGBT studies and disability studies. So there it's about three types of stigma. The first important type of stigma is basically the stigma attached to the people, the appearance. Second is basically the religious one. Basically, the LGBT. So what is the concern for us is basically the first model. So people who have blindness or have any sort of disabilities, when they appear in the society, these two ideologies, the ideology of unity and the ideology of ableism, try to marginalize people with disabilities. How does it marginalize? It's marginalized by excluding them, as I said earlier, by differentiating those bodies, by criminalizing those bodies. So how the process actually is carried out? It is carried out through the understanding of stigma. Right? Stigma, needless to say, as on the field people have read.
Hello.
So how?
Hello.
Yeah, hello. Am I audible? Yeah. Yeah, am I audible? Yeah, hello.
You're not audible. Carry on.
Yes, sir.
Am I audible, right?
You carry on, sir.
Oh, sorry, somebody was actually, okay, I thought I was not audible. Okay, so some people, if you have read correlated by Nathaniel Hawkins, will be able to understand how it operates. Right? So needless to explain, MS is a very powerful idea.
Yes, sir. Please continue. Yes, sir. Yes. Very much audible, sir. Now.
Internet
But the sound breaks, sir.
it often happens with me on Google Meet. I don't know. Okay, so let me just continue with where I left. So I was talking to you about the idea of stigma. I was saying that it is actually rapid, right? The way in which the stigma operates, that all of us have internalized, sort of, goes into our consciousness. That has been there in literature, culture, and so on and so forth. So when we go into the literature part, you'll be able to understand that concept, right? So moving on to the another important keyword is basically embodiment. So embodiment and the culture, especially the next keyword, the fifth keyword, they are particularly relevant to people, disability, the sort of literature written by the disabled, right? So, so starting with the idea of embodiment, the embodiment is basically a philosophical one. It has been derived from Morley Ponde's very important book titled Phenomenology of Perception. Right? So it sort of tells us that the disabled people, right? So they look at the world, they experience the world through their body. So basically, how the body of a disabled person experiences the world, the physical environment, the culture, and so on and so forth, that in fact constitutes the embodiment. So to put it simply, embodiment is basically refers to the experience of the disabled body. Let's say the person with the blindness. The person with blindness, he understands the place in which he lives through this tactile, through touch, through, let's say, auditory perception, through the senses, the smell and other things, right? So basically, these things formulate the embodiment of the disabled, the blind person. In the case of sighted people, the people with vision, they go by what they see, right? So in the case of people with physical impairment, they go by their embodiment is different from the embodiment of the blind people, because for them, they are on the wheelchair, they will be looking at the building or the society that they navigate through certain amount of the their own impairment, how the impairment enables them to to sort of have an understanding of how this disability operates, right? So that is basically embodiment. The moving on to the next important one, the disability, the culture. Culture is basically that all of us people who have orientation with culture studies would be able to understand, is basically refers to the behavior, right? The behavior or the inherited pattern that we sort of live with, right? So in the case of disabled also, there is something called the disability culture. That disability culture is basically framed by the embodiment. Right? The embodiment, as I said, is an experience. So the experience of the disabled people, which is obviously varied from one disability to another disability, formulates the culture of their own person. For example, they have deaf culture, blind culture, crippled culture. There is a very important book titled Crip Theory, right, written by Robert McCruver, where he talks about the idea how the kind of crippleness or the disability, right, has created its own culture, right? So that is very much abundant in the literature written by the disabled, the whole range of autobiographies written by the disabled, the poem, the poetries, for the poems, the very type of poems written by the deaf poet, crippled, physically impaired poet, visually impaired poet, right? So that is basically culture. As in that, I can go on and on, but looking at the time, it's important for us to cut short certain things, right? Okay, so this is basically the five sort of ideologies, certain key concepts. They have constituted the major chunk of disability studies, right? So let's try to understand how these five key concepts are helping us understand this literary disability studies. So basically, literature. One is disability in literature and literature in disability. So disability in literature refers to the representation of disabled in literature, and the literature in disability refers to uh, the literature written by the disabled, right? So now I'm moving on to the second section of my talk. So I said that I would actually brief you certain key texts that have been published in the area of literary disability studies. Along with that, I would also be giving you certain key concepts those texts actually sort of put forth. To start with, the first important text, which is not often acknowledged in the literary disability studies, but I deem it as a very important intervention by the activist. It is actually by Kenneth Jenigan, who was the president of National Federation of the Blind, NFB USA. The title of the article is it was a speech delivered in 1974. Right now, it is available as an article. The title of the article is "Blindness is Literature Against Us." A very important intervention. Blindness, is literature against us, published in 1974. This is the, I basically consider is the inaugural text of literary disability studies. So in this article, he enlists or enumerates 9 important ways in which the Western literature, that goes true for Indian literature as well, have portrayed blind people. Right? Let me just list out those 9 things. I don't think I'll have enough time to sort of get into those things. I'll leave it to you. You can read that article. It's pretty much available online. So the 9 ways are. The first important one is blind people are portrayed as, or blindness is portrayed as compensatory or miraculous one, right? So if you look at the literature, we often see that blind people are portrayed as, for example, if you have lost one senses and other senses will compensate. Blind, and in India, in Indian mythology also, we have Sudas, we have seen a lot of blind saints that they have a enormous power of soothsaying ability. They can predict the future, right? So this is not actually so, but this is actually sort of the, this is how literature has represented people with the blindness. So basically it portrays, the first theme, as I said, is actually blindness as miraculous power. It has a compensatory ability for the loss of sight. Right? So which is not often true, but this is how, in an exaggerated fashion, Western literature has actually portrayed. You have, if you look at this Sophocles' plays, there is Tiresias, the blind saint, you sort of often portrayed in the thing. Also in the Oedipus Rex, you find he puts out his eyes and he becomes a saint. Right? So similarly in Shakespeare's King Lear, you have Gloucester, somebody who has been punished for his adultery, but becomes a very, very, virtuous person, right? So this is a very important thing. Moving on to the second important thing is blindness as total tragedy. Right? So basically, what I said earlier, subscribing the individual model of disability, that is, disability is a personal tragedy, right? So blind people in Indian literature also, you can see they have been portrayed as a very, very tragic figures, right? So in the sense that they are leading a life of tragedy, right? Especially after King Oedipus, when he puts out his eyes as a punishment for the incest, so he says that, somebody tells him that it's better to die than live as a blind, right? So blindness is basically a tragedy, right? So there are a lot of examples we can go on, but you'll be able to recall certain things. And the third important thing is blindness as foolishness. This is also very prominent in Western literature as well as in Indian literature. Let me often blind people are portrayed as ignorant people, a very, very sort of foolish people. As a very obvious example is Chaucer's Canterbury's Tales, the Merchant Tales. The Merchant Tale, you find a blind man is married to, a old blind man is married to a young woman. So they go out for walking, and the girl actually, the lady, the sighted young lady makes the blind man sit under the tree, and she goes and makes love with another person. So when this guy regains his vision back, and when he finds out uh, that I don't know if it's frequently my connection is getting
Okay, sir. It's okay.
Google Meet. Okay, it's okay. So I was just telling that in Canterbury Tales, the blind, especially Merchant Tale, the blind. I mean, old man is married to a young sighted girl, lady. They go out for walking, and the sighted lady makes the blind man sit under the tree, and then she goes out to make a love with another person. The blind guy man regains his vision back, and when he finds out that his wife is making love, she comes and tells him that no, I did it in order to get your vision back. So look at how foolish it is. In the sense that there are a lot of other examples also. There's in one play, the three blind people are actually duped by another sighted by a sighted man by giving them by telling them that I have given money to one of you, but when they go out and have sort of good food in the restaurant, and when they when they come out to pay the bill, they find that the money is not there with any one of them, right? So these sort of examples are abundant, that blindness is often portrayed as some sort of foolishness, right? And you have in Tagore's thing also, this Tagore is known for portraying blind people in a very, very ignorant and foolish manner. Especially this happens through a range of metaphors, right? There's a very important, I often cite this as a very important example, is by, yeah. Yeah, so the very prominent example is by the Tagore in the essay titled "The Freedom." I think some of you have actually read that essay. If you look at the beginning of the essay, it begins like this: freedom without spirituality is like a blind man groping in the open air. Right. So look at this thing. So he wants to criticize Gandhi's notion of, this political freedom. He says that if you have a freedom, if you have only political freedom without spiritual freedom, it will be useless. But in order to show this, he says that it's like a blind man groping in the open air. Look at the very powerful metaphor that Tagore is using. Also in his book titled "The Gift of Sight," there also he presupposes, sort of vision over blindness. So Tagore is known for this sort of metaphors, very, very sort of degrading metaphors towards blind people, right? So moving on to the next important one is blindness as wickedness. So it is there in many of the things that blind people. In one story, a blind man actually makes a small boy stand against a sort of huge pole, and he knocks his head. Right, and the young boy's ear is bleeding with blood. Right, so this kind of a wickedness is actually prevalent in the in the Western literature as well as in Indian literature also, right? So, and moving on to the next important one is blindness is a perfect virtue. So this is also very important that we often see that blind people are portrayed as absolutely what you call virtuous people. It's a sort of a gift that as I already said, that Tagore's book, the gift of sight. That means that that basically presupposes how the blindness has been belittled. But in this frame, in this sort of element, you find that blind people are often portrayed as a virtuous people. They are actually they have a very, very enormous power to predict, as I said in the first theme, that is blindness as a miraculous power, right? So this is also very important sort of intervention, right? So next important thing is blindness as a punishment. So needless to say, in Shakespeare, Gloucester is punished because of his adultery. In Oedipus' Rex, King Oedipus was punished because of his incest. So this punishment is done by the writer without any sort of a thing. So basically he will not kill the kind of what you call flawed character. What he will do is he will rather disable the character, right? So this is very prominent in Western literature. So you find characters are often punished because of their certain sins that they committed in the early birth, or because of certain thing that they commit in the present day birth. Even our Hindu religion also says disability is a karma, right? Because of the sin committed in the previous birth, one is actually born with this, born with disability, right? So moving on to the next important one is basically disability as a dehumanization. So needless to say, when somebody is disabled, he lacks to be a human. He doesn't actually exist to be a human. He has been dehumanized. So King Oedipus has been dehumanized because he has committed the incest, and Gloucester has been dehumanized because he committed adultery. Right. So there is a certain amount of dehumanization happens in the text, basically carried out by the writer, right? So this is something we need to also understand, right? So the next important one is disability as a purity. It's a very important thing. Somebody is punished, somebody is dehumanized, not to, in a way, according to this sort of ideology, not to make the person cease to exist. It is to basically, what we call cleanse the sin that he has committed. So basically, if you look at the New Testament also, you find Old Testament says disability is a sin. Or New Testament says disability is not a sin. It's basically a gift given by the God in order to experience the new world. So this is also very problematic because, once either they portray disabled as completely extraordinary people, or they portray disabled as completely what you call dehumanized manner. So they are not ordinary, as Kenneth Jenigan says, they are not ordinary. They're not extraordinary. They want to be the ordinary people, right? So this is a very important thing. And the ninth important one is blindness as a symbol or parable. Needless to explain, blind people have been portrayed in the story or in the novel or in the literature to exemplify certain parables, certain moral stories. This is also very, very problematic because that is actually, very problematic one, because if you go by the next important text which I want to introduce is basically David Mitchell, Sharon Snyder. It's very important book titled Narrative Processes. So the narrative processes. This narrative processes, they say that it's a 2000. The book was published in 2000. It talks about the how disability has been portrayed as a clutch, as a sort of a crutch to depend on the certain metaphors, in the sense that the narrative of the story or the novel has been constructed on the disabled body in order to exemplify the able-bodied people. For example, as I said earlier, Tagore portrayed the blind person not to represent how blind people, live, but to, as a sort of a metaphor to exemplify his idea of spiritual freedom. So that is to say, basically how Tagore basically looked at blind people. So going by this ideal, this understanding of narrative processes, see the disabled body has been represented in the literature as a powerful metaphor, not to again depict how disabled people live, but to depict how the but to establish the corporeal normativity or able-bodied element of the quote unquote able people, right? So this is something that is actually very important by the David Mitchell and Sahib, that they have looked at the whole range of text. So basically, they look at that disability as a sort of a crutch to depend on certain to depend on disability to create certain amount of corporeal normativity. To establish certain things, they belittle disabled people. This has been there in the Western literary trends and also in Indian literary trends as well. So if you look at the another important work by Otto Koisen is basically a aesthetic nervousness. It was published in 2007. He looks at the aesthetic part of how the disabled people who are represented in the literature in three ways. The first way is how disabled character interacts with the non-disabled character in the text. Second is how the writer conceives the disabled character, then how he actually puts it in the creative work. And third is how the readers who actually encounter the disabled character in the literature, how do they react? So Otto Koisen basically says that when we all of us have sort of read about how aestheticism actually emerged as a very important very important aspect of art for art's sake, sort of created by Walter Pater, and especially in the late 19th century writers, right? So Otto Koisen says that we look at the text, especially the protagonist in the novel or in the play, from our understanding of normalcy and ability. So what does that understanding tell us? That a hero in the novel or in the hero in the film should be necessarily quote unquote able-bodied person, quote unquote normal person, right? If we encounter, let's say, a blind person as a protagonist in the novel, we are not actually willing to accept. We are hesitant. How come he will be a hero? What will look? Because already it has created certain amount of curiosity within us, right? So the kind of aestheticism, the aesthetic beauty set out by, let's say, Walter Pater and the range of 19th century writers, it is, according to Otto Koisen, also by, let's say, another important text by titled Disability Aesthetics by Tobin Siebert. For these two people, that was published in 2010, for these two people, the ideology of aestheticism or the literary aesthetic beauty itself is a able beauty, itself is a normal beauty, right? So the text will be incomplete if the hero, cease to be let's say, quote unquote able person, quote unquote normal person, right? So this is something that is very important. That is the reason why the non-disabled character, because after all, it's a creation of the writer, who is also a victim of social consciousness prevalent in the society. That social consciousness absolutely excludes the disabled people based on the ideology of stigma, normalcy, and ableism, right? So therefore, the disabled character interacts with the non-disabled character, creates some sort of a rupture in the text, right? That particular rupture is in fact conceived by the writer. Yes. So in the text, when that particular rupture is created by the sort of or conceived by the reader while reading the text, it spoils what Otto Koisen says is basically the aesthetic beauty. So the aesthetic beauty basically are necessarily being an able-bodied normative one when it is conceived by the quote unquote the reader, though the person is disabled, let it be the person disabled reader, then also he will not be able to accept a blind character being a blind person being a hero, because that is how he has been projected, right? That is why Kenneth Jenigan says, if you look at Samson and Agnes by Milton, that the text was written by Milton after he became blind. But if you look at the text, he very sort of pejoratively, very negatively, he has portrayed disabled a blind person in the text Samson and Agnes, right? And also, if you look at this poem on his blindness, when he says, "When I consider how my light is spent here, half my days in this dark world and white." Look at this thing. For him, living in blindness is basically living with blindness is basically living with darkness, right? So this is something that is a very prevalent one, right? And also there is an other important text. You have Rosemary Collins Thompson's Normate and Leonard Davis' book title. Rosemary Collins Thompson's book title Extraordinary Bodies, published in 1997. I did not go go deep into the text because I already talked about normalcy in the beginning. And in Leonard Davis' book title Enforcing Normalcy, published in 1995. These two are very important books. And there's another important book by Alice Hall. The title of the book is Literature and Disability, published by Routledge. This also very important book. He talks about how both the things, how literature looks at disabled, how disabled created their own literature. Basically, so it talks about deaf literature, blind literature, literature by the crippled people, physically impaired people, and the whole range of also literature by the autistic people, right? So this actually sort of makes me get into the third important section of my talk. Yes, so I'm aware that it's almost, yes. It takes me to the third important talk. I'm actually running out of time. All right, so let me just take it up some 10 minutes. I'll sort of wind it up. And the third important section of my talk is basically literature by the disabled. So there are a lot of things by literature by the disabled. I'll talk about rather three important things. Yes, the first one which I want to talk about is basically the text written by Thomas D. Cowser. The title of the article, it is there in the book title, Cambridge Companion to Literature and Disability. It's a very important book. You can actually, all of you can read it. Okay, so I think there's a lot of interruption. I'm very sorry, extremely sorry. So I'll just go quickly sort of take just a brief view about this thing. Literature by the disabled. It's actually, I was talking about Thomas D. Cowser's very important book, article titled Signifying Self, Disability and Life Writing. It is published in the book titled Cambridge Companion to Literature and Disability, where he talks about the origin of disability life writings. So he traces to 1754 book titled Deformity by William Hay. He was a British parliamentarian. He says that disability is basically a positive identity. So there was an inaugural book in the life writing of people with disabilities that was published in 1754, and after that, in the 19th century, there were a lot of autobiographies written by disabled people, especially people who were put in the asylums, who were put in the institutions. And the later half of the 20th century, especially after 1980s onwards, there's a whole range of autobiographies written by the disabled. Now, what they do, these autobiographies, the poems, particularly there's a whole range of poems. What they do is basically they try to sort of represent the what Thomas D. Cowser says. They have a counter discursive self-representation. That is to say, basically how they in a way, challenge the prominent sort of disability representation, which I listed in my second phase of my talk. How they sort of looked at they challenged those very flawed and very, very stigmatized normative ableistic representation of the disabled body through disability poems and disability, autobiographies, disability novels, and so on and so forth. In India, there are actually a number of autobiographies. Let me just list out one or two. There's a book titled Fallen Standing, My Life with Schizophrenia, written by Reshma Valliyappan, a very important text. She's a schizophrenic. She has talked about how she basically, lives with schizophrenia. And she completely demolishes the popular understanding of schizophrenia, which only sort of marginalized the stigma, schizophrenic people. There's another text, needless to say, it's by Preeti Manga. It's titled The Other Senses. It's a blind autobiography. She's one of the very early autobiographies by the disabled people in India. There's another text titled basically One Little Finger by Malini Chip, very powerful autobiography. It basically talks about disability embodiment and disability culture. And if you look at the people with autistic, there is a very important book titled Thinking in Picture, My Life with Autism by Temple Grandin, a very important book. So it talks about how autistic people live their life, and it again challenges the mainstream understanding of autism, right? So if you look at poetry also, there are a lot of actually poems written by deaf people, blind people. In India, we have two important blind poets. One is by Josna Fanuja, she is working at University of Delhi, and another one is by Tito Rajasi Mukhopadhyaya. Josna Fanuja is a blind poet. Tito Rajasi Mukhopadhyaya is basically an autistic poet. If you just Google it up, you will get a lot of poems by him. And the popular poems are A Simple Cup is a very important poem. So like that, there are a lot of autobiographies. There are as much as right now there are more than 200 disabled autobiographies are available. Right. So we need to basically, look at those. This literary disability studies provides ample hope for further research, future research also. One can look at the intersectionality of disability and gender. One can look at Black disabled life narrative, Arab disabled life narratives, right? There's a range of things. Even one can also look at the representation of disabled in vernacular literature. For example, Malayalam literature, Malayalam cinema, and Tamil cinema, regional literature, regional cinema, and regional culture, especially the proverbs. If you take, for instance, proverbs, they have a very, very negative, pejorative representation of the disabled people, right? So let me stop here, and I'm very sorry for the lot of interruption happened due to this connection. So I request some of Jayalakshmi ma'am to read out the poem. It's actually by a deaf poet. So she will read out the poem. That will actually sum up my section, the third section of my talk. Jayalakshmi ma'am, can you read out the poem?
Sir, hello.
Yeah. Just read out the poem, ma'am. Yeah.
Sir Deepa, I invite Dr. Deepa to render the poem. Hello, sir.
Yeah. Just please read out the poem for participants.
Okay, sir. The poem is titled, "You Have to Be Deaf to Understand." The poem goes like this. What is it like to hear a hand? You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like to be a small child in a school, in a room void of sound, with a teacher who talks and talks and talks, and then when she does come around to you, she expects you to know what she has said. You have to be deaf to understand. Or the teacher thinks that to make you smart, you must first learn how to talk with your voice. So mumbo jumbo with hands on your face for hours and hours without patience or end, until out comes a faint resembling sound. You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like to be curious, to thirst for knowledge you can call your own, with an inner desire that's set on fire, and you ask a brother, sister, or friend who looks in answer and says, never mind. You have to be deaf to understand. What it is like in a corner to stand, though there is nothing you have done really wrong, other than try to make use of your hands to a silent fear to communicate a thought that comes to your mind all at once. You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like to be shouted at when one thinks that will help you to hear, or misunderstand the words of a friend who is trying to make a joke clear, and you don't get the point because he has failed? You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like to be laughed in the face when you try to repeat what is said, just to make sure that you have understood, and you find that the words were misread, and you want to cry out, please help me, friend? You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like to have to depend upon one who can hear to phone a friend, or place a call to a business firm and be forced to share what is personal and then find that your message wasn't clear? You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like to be deaf and alone in the company of those who can hear and you only give a guess as you go along, for no one is there with a helping hand as you try to keep up with words and songs? You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like on the road of life to meet with a stranger who opens his mouth and speaks out a line at a rapid pace, and you can't understand the look in his face because it is new and you're lost in a race? You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like to comprehend some nimble fingers that paint the scene and make you smile and feel serene, with the spoken word of the moving hand that makes you part of the word at last? You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like to hear a hand? Yes, you have to be deaf to understand.
Yeah, thank you. So with that, let me just wind up, because this poem sums up the keyword 3 and 4 I was talking about, basically embodiment and culture. It says that how deaf people are caught up, are really trying to make sense of the rapid words uttered by the hearing people who have speech ability, especially like us, right? So it's a very important intervention by the poet. So this poem, like this, there are a range of poems that talk about blindness, that talk about deafness, that talk about, there's a very important poem titled Cripple Lullaby, right, by Cyril Mary Waits, right? So that poem also very important poem. So there are disability theater, right? Where if you just Google it up, disabled arts, right? Disabledarts.com, right? The people often stage plays by disabled people often stage plays. They perform plays, right? So there are a lot of range of things. There's a very famous essay by um, Nancy Mayer is titled on Being a Cripple, right? So these are all the very important essays. I really don't have time to get into all these things. I just wind up here, and I'm very sorry for the intervention caused from my end. And thank you so much for the opportunity. If there is any question, we'll take it up.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for the enlightening session. Now, I will invite Nishad sir to voice the questions that placed from the chat box.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you for your invitation. Actually, there is a question from the past participant, Ms. Madhumita. Her question is, sir, please share your views or perspectives on Milton when I consider home, how my life is spent. She wants to know your perspectives.
Yeah, I already said it, right. So Milton, basically, if you look at that poem, basically it talks about, it's a very autobiographical poem. And even if you look at it, it's actually titled On His Blindness. It should have been On My Blindness, right? So basically, it's an autobiographical poem, but that basically talks about how he has spent his vision. But one thing I absolutely love, the way in which I often, sort of internalize it to myself also, the look at the title, the very beginning lines, right? When I consider how my light is spent. So basically, we don't spend the light. We spend money, we spend water, we spend things. Light is something, we don't spend it, right? So, but somebody, he became blind, and he says, he wrote this poem after he became blind, and he says, when I consider how my light is spent. So it is something that is a very, very important one. But then, in the sense that somebody who lived in the 17th century, so sort of subscribing to the then prevalent ideology that is people who do not have vision is better to die than live, right? So that is the prominent thing that was there. Even if you look at John Locke's very famous book titled Essay Concerning Human Understanding, he says who will be a human? Somebody who has the rationality, who is able to think, who is able to make sense of it. So that was the time in which Milton was writing. So basically, he prioritized vision over blindness. In fact, he felt bad for having lost his vision, right? So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Another question from Gunjan Chaturvedi. His question is, can we consider Babsi Sidwas, the ice candy man, as a study in disability? Did you get it, sir?
Yeah, why not? Why not? Wapsis, it was Ice Candy Man can be considered a study in disability. In fact, one of my students back at AMU, she was working on this Ice Candy Man. She was looking at how post-colonial fiction represent women with the disabilities. Right? Obviously, we can. Why not? But it has its own very flawed understanding. We need to basically, unearth the politics of representation. Just because it's written by a sort of post-colonial writer, the representation cannot be brushed aside, because it's very important for us to revisit the entire canon of Indian literature, particularly Indian writing in English and Indian literatures in English, from the perspective of disability studies. Then we would be able to get very different understanding of the text. Compared to the understanding that we have today. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Noble A. Palyat. He says, in spite of much intellectual deliberations on disability studies, do you think there will be a change in societal attitude towards the disabled community? What are your views on that?
Yes. Obviously, yes. There is actually in the disability study, there are, as far as disability is concerned, rather, there are two realms actually that are running parallelly. One is the activist realm, another is academic realm. The kind of texts that have been produced in India so far, there are three texts that have been produced in the academic realm. The very popular text, one is Interrogating Disability edited by Nandini Ghosh, and another one is Disability in South Asia, edited by Anita Gai. Third one is Disability Studies in India, edited by Nilika Mehrotra. These three texts have very radically sort of changed, tried to, they tried to change the understanding of disability in the society. But as you know, that it takes a lot of time. Even if you take, for instance, communism for that matter, even Dalitism for that matter, they are not able to change this Indian society, because Indian society, as I said, it is absolutely caste-ridden, religiously divided, economically divided, and linguistically divided, right? But we often, there are a lot of aspiration also among us. So we often ask the person, somebody is blind, we don't accept he is blind. We say, if somebody donates eyes, will you be able to get your vision back? So that is again and again, these questions seems to be very innocent question, very, very ignorant question. But this question, if you look at the politics of this question comes with certain package that at least you should get your vision back, because you cannot live your life with blindness, right? So this attitude has to change. We need to accept disability as a difference, as a corporeal difference, not as something, an anomaly, not as something a deviant which has to be got rid of, right? So yes, it has to travel a long way. That's very as I said, in USA and all, it changed very radically. But in India, we are very recently, 2016 only, we enacted Rights of Persons with Disability Studies, Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In 2016, that was implemented from 2017 onwards. Earlier, there was something called PWD Act, Persons with Disability Act, Equal Participation, Protection of Rights and full participation. So this is something that was there in 1995. But very recently, we enacted that yes, the changes are happening, but it's happening in a very piecemeal fashion. It has to happen in a very radical way. And webinars like this are very, very important intervention. And people who are listening to it, they should start a course in their own colleges and universities, especially teachers. They need to offer a course titled Disability Studies and Literature in their colleges and universities. This is a way in which we can change. For example, Dalit literature, when it emerged, within 2 decades, it was able to have a huge influence. That it was able to create courses in many universities and colleges. That has to happen with the disability studies as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next question is from the participant Ega Peter. He has 2 questions to us. The first is, what is the politically correct term to refer to disabled people in India? The second question is, nothing about us without us is a prominent disability slogan. Do you think it undermines the research into disability studies by people who identify as able?
Yes, very good question. The 2 are very, very important questions, wonderful questions. The first one is, there are 2 important understanding that are actually developed by disability studies with reference to calling people with disabilities. One is the person first understanding. Second is disability first understanding. The first one is person first understanding calls for humanizing disabled people. We need to understand they are human beings. So that's why in the Indian Constitution also we have persons with disabilities, right? And I would prefer the first one, right? And the second important thing is disability first understanding. It's a very identity politics sort of a one. It says that we are disabled, just like Dalit, right? We are Dalit, therefore we should be called as Dalit. We don't want to be called as Harijan. So similarly, we have to be, this understanding says that the disabled person has to be called as a disabled person or blind person or deaf person, because that is his understanding, that is his identity. Right? The rest of the identities like religion, caste, language, region that come later. The first and foremost one is basically you should call the person as person with his disability, that is his foremost identity. It is called disability pride movement. Somebody is not, according to this movement, one is not actually mourning the loss of disability, loss of sight or loss of a hearing ability. One is celebrating that thing. It is called disability gain also. They gained something by being disabled, right? So these are the two things. It is all left to you to. I prefer the first one, and so it is up to you to call any of the things. But otherwise, this euphemisms like differently able, specially able, these are all particularly personally. It's an insult to the disabled people because they are not differently able. The society should be differently able to accommodate the disabled people, right? Even today, ATMs are not accessible, public buildings are not accessible, transport is not accessible, except metro and airports. None of the transport facilities are accessible for people with disabilities. So we need to, nothing is going to change if you call disabled person as Divyang or specially able or specially gifted, godchild, or differently able. It's better to call them as people with the disabilities, person with the blindness, person with the deafness, because that is the appropriate term to call because that defines what they are, rather than all the euphemisms only talk about what they are not. So I'm not a differently able person. Somebody cannot be a differently able person. In that way, all of us are differently abled, right? Okay, so coming to the second important question is nothing about us without us. That is a slogan framed by the activist in the 1980s, right? But disability studies in the academic realm, academia does not embrace that thing. It doesn't. Then it will lead to hardcore identity politics. It doesn't acknowledge this thing. Disability studies is always, ready to accept good epistemologies coming from non-disabled or disabled or anybody. If you are able to make a very fruitful contribution, disability studies will obviously remember. I told you the three books, for example, Neelika Mehrotra's book also, many of them are not disabled. Even if I'm not mistaken, Neelika Mehrotra ma'am, she is not disabled. There are a lot of works have been done. For example, Leonard Davis, he is not disabled. He has edited 5 volumes of disability studies reader. Right? So it's basically, if you're able to make a good contribution to the disability studies, obviously you'll be remembered.
Thank you so much, sir. Our next question is from the participant, Noble A. Palyat. He wants to know, what is your take on the change in the usage of terms like disabled and differently abled?
I already said it.
Yes, the question, sir. Sorry. Are these terms foregrounding concepts like segregation or accommodation?
See, differently able euphemisms are obviously any euphemism that you use to talk about disabled, they are obviously segregating disabled. Again and again, you are saying that you are not able like us, you are differently abled. You are not normal like us, you are specially abled. So these terms again and again will obviously segregate the disabled. That basically they are basically an insult to the people with the disabilities because you are excluding them. It's better to call them, with person first terminology, that is person with the blindness, person with the deafness, that actually defines what they are. I would recommend you, I recommend you to basically the book, and that a very important article which I just pronounced just 10 minutes ago. It is basically Nancy Ma's article title on being a cripple. So please go through this thing. You'll be able to get much more understanding.
Okay, sir. Another query from Aradhika Ganguly. She asked, as an academic, do you think the whole of academia has internalized ableism in some form or other? And how does it affect scholars and teachers who identify themselves as disabled?
Yes, obviously, it is true. Very important one. There is I'm reminded of a book titled Academic Ableism. Very important book that talks about how ableism prevails in academia. Right? So, for example, even today in the private colleges, just honestly think for yourselves, how many blind faculties are working in private colleges? Right? Often people have PhDs from many universities, very well-reputed universities, and they are not actually given appointments. By primarily, they're not even called to appear in the interview, right? They primarily, because the moment you mention you are blind, you are physically impaired, the next question is, how do you teach? How do you use PPT? How do you control the class? These questions often arise. I've taught maximum 150 students at Aligarh Muslim University, right? So, but then this is a sort of an understanding. This is how ableism operates. Without even getting to know what is the person's knowledge, whether the person is eligible or not, whether the person is really capable to teach or not. We often, come with a sort of a stereotypical ableist understanding. Just because he is blind, no, no, no. Just don't call him, call somebody who is able. So this is very true. The academic ableism. I would ask you to go through the book, Academic Ableism, very powerful book that actually enumerates the kind of ableism that we have to live through day and day out. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Another participant, Miss Anju Unni, wants to know your explanation about disability and sexuality.
Yes, very important question once again. There is disability and sexuality. Due to lack of time, I wanted to talk about it. I couldn't talk about it. So, for example, in all the mythologies, all the religious mythologies, disabled people are portrayed as asexual beings. Therefore, they are not actually capable, they're not eligible for marriage. It is there in Hindu religion also. It is there in other things also. You can actually recall the kind of the Puranas that you have read, the epics you have read. And there is a very important blog titled Skin Stories. SKIN, Skin Stories, curated by the people with the disabilities. They talk about disability and sexuality. And other than that, there are a lot of other works also. That there is a organization called Rising Flame. Niti Goel from Mumbai is curating that. She's basically the founder of that organization. You can even Google it up. You can even YouTube it. Just type Niti Goel. You will get a lot of talks on disability and sexuality. I think that it's also a very important one. We need to basically, sexuality, disability studies is a very important one. We need to explore more on this. It has very recently, there's a girl from AUD, Ambedkar University, Delhi. She worked on disability and sexuality. And but otherwise, a lot of works have not been, done. There's a huge possibility you can explore this area. And in the West, there are people like Rosemary Garland Thompson, and Simi Linton, the range of other people have worked on it, especially disability and sex.
Yeah, carry on, sir.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible, sir.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. Actually, again, there's a connection issue.
Okay,
Yeah, so I was just saying that Robert McCuver's book titled this crypt theory. He talks about this basically disability and sexuality, right? So the LGBT intersections with the disability. That also very important one. Somebody can actually read that one also. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. And another question is also from Ega Peter. She contends that the three books you mentioned about academic interventions into disability in India are written by women. Do you think that there is any intimate relationship between disability and femininity? She just wanted to know.
Obviously, and yes. So it's. I was also wondering about this thing long back. So yes. So the three books were written by women. Even if you look at Indian disability studies, mostly it is actually dominated by women. So yes, obviously there are a couple of men writers out there, but they have only contributed chapters and articles. Even as I said earlier, Jagdish Chandra's thesis titled "Movement of the Organized Blind in India," submitted to University of Syracuse University, that has not been published into a book. Yeah, the thesis is pretty much available online, but it has not been published into a book. Yes, yeah, from the beginning, if you could look at it, be it is Extraordinary Body by Rosemary Collin Thompson or Rejected Bodies by Susan Wendels. The feminist disability studies has been very prominent, especially in disability studies, right? So it was very prominent, and I wouldn't obviously say that it is it is only dominated by women, but at least in India it is dominated by women. But in the West, you have a lot of men writers out there. The kind of books I told you, be it is Enforcing Normalcy, be it is Narrative Pacifist, Aesthetic Nervousness, Disability Aesthetics, and disability theories, and all these things. Yeah, there are a lot of men writers also there, yes, but you are right. But in the late 1990s onwards, feminist disability studies is very prominent. You can look at the article titled Feminist Disability Studies written by Rosemary Collin Thompson. The article is available on JSTOR. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. There is another question from our dear colleague, Dr. Govind R. He wants to know, disability involves a course of negotiations between the state, the social institutions, and the self. How could this be optimized theoretically and practically?
Yeah, that is a huge problem now. See, for example, even while defining disability, there are a number of issues that are there. For example, WHO has defined disability in a different manner, and United Nations, UNCRPD has looked at disability in a different manner. Indian Constitution, right, especially the RPWD Act looks at disability in a different manner. Academia looks at disability in a different manner. But having, let's say, a synthesis of all these divergent definitions or the theorizations of disability into one rubric is very problematic. That's the reason why you have different types of disability studies. So today we are concerned with literary disability studies. There is something called legal disability studies, educational disability studies, sociological disability studies, cultural disability studies, right? And the sports disability studies, media disability studies, sexuality and disability studies. So like that, each sort of institutions have looked at disability in a different manners, right? So that's why it's basically very difficult to have a synergy of these things, because state operates in a different manner. As you know, that state is not concerned with people with the disabilities. If it is really concerned with people with disabilities, it would have done a lot of things. In India, we have 2.21% of disabled people as per 2011 census. But you know what is the enrollment of people with the disabilities in higher education institutions? It's only 0.56%. And there's a newspaper article which says very clearly that not even out of 800 odd universities that are there, including private and government universities, not even 1% of universities are accessible for persons with disabilities. So this is the state of a state in India, right? In the way it really tells us that how the state really is concerned about people with disability. But on the other hand, the society tends to prescribe a lot of inscriptions on the disabled body. For example, normalcy, ableism, stigma, so on and so forth. Right? So yes, the disabled body is obviously caught between the society, which is stigmatized, which is constantly stigmatizing, excluding, and defaming the disabled body. On the other side, the state, which only operates through certain legal terminologies. Let's say that it says only 40% percent and above can be only called as legally disabled, what they call as benchmark disabilities. So what about people who cannot see, who don't have, let's say, 35% of disability? Does it mean those people cannot be called considered as disabled people? That's why I said the state has defined disability for its own convenience, not for the convenience of disabled people. Yeah. Yeah. Hello.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. And Ms. Madhumita has one more question to ask. Actually, she wants to comment on your views on Tagore. She asked, Tagore also wrote, when I had eyesight, I looked at the outer world. Now that the light of my eyes is gone, I shall look inward. The metaphors he used reinforce operative cultural symbols and not deliberately degrading. So please share your perspectives on this.
Yes. So again, this again a very problematic thing. See, for example, that is why I said that disability, the blindness is often seen as, let's say, compensatory or miraculous power. He said that when I had a vision, I looked outside. When I don't have vision, I look inside. This is the problem with which we often look at people with blindness. Don't worry, you have inner vision. My question is, don't all of us have inner vision? Right? All of us have inner vision. Vision is what? The way in which we conceptualize certain things. Right? Let's say that we have inner vision. Why only the blind people have inner vision? This goes same for all the people, right? I'm not actually degrading your argument. Your argument may be wrong, may be right, but if you look at it from the disability perspective, it doesn't really fall in place because all of us have, in a way, inner vision, right? So why only disabled people have inner vision? Or let's say blind people have inner vision. Right? So this is something we need to ask, right? And moreover, if you look at this, the thing I just quoted, it's an exact quotation from thing. You can even Google it up. Right? It says right, that freedom without spirituality. Right? Look at this sentence. Why? I mean, I understand that we day to day we use a lot of terms like we say he turned a deaf ear towards me. It's a crippled government, right? It's a handicapped government, right? Blind leading the blind. A lot of usages we use. It's okay. Though those usages are very problematic, but why blind man? Why Tagore has to use blind man groping in the open air? Isn't it I mean, I'm not again blaming Tagore. I'm saying that this is a culture, this is a society. The society has to be blamed because the society was, in a way, propagating certain ableistic normative understanding of the blind people, right? So that's why I said that inner vision is very problematic. We need to again reconsider this thing that looking inside is everyone can look inside. Everyone has, let's say, if I were to ask somebody that what is your vision about your future, who would say that I want to become a doctor, I want to become a professor, I want to let's say clear IAS. In that way, everyone has a vision. In what way vision of the blind, the inner vision of the blind is different from inner vision of the sighted person. So this distinction is really I'm not able to arrive at. So that's why I said it.
No, thank you so much. One more question, sir. Ms. Shimi has a question to ask you. What is your suggestion regarding Indian disability writers? Can you suggest any Indian disability writers, either fiction or non-fiction?
Yeah. So the one person which actually comes to my mind is basically Fardos Ganga. He is a very popular novelist. So he has a book titled Trying to Grow, novel titled Trying to Grow. He is a dwarf, right? Somebody is very short, so a dwarf. So it's a novel. You can probably look at it. And there are a number of autobiographies. I even said it during my talk. I said if you want to read about cerebral palsy, it's a book titled One Little Finger by Molly Chip. If you want to read about blindness, there is a book titled The Other Senses by Preeti Manga. And also there is another book titled by L. Subramaniam. The title of the book is Lights Out. Right? And if you want to read about schizophrenia, there is a book titled Pollen Standing, My Life with Schizophrenia. And there's another book also, No Looking Back by Shivani Gupta. She's also again a physically impaired person. So there are a lot of texts, obviously, though there are not many, but there are actually, I think, 10 to 15 texts are there. And I think in regional languages also there might be a couple of texts we need to explore. I really don't have much understanding in the regional languages. But in India, as I said, all these texts started coming only after 2005. So to be precise, only after 2010, right? So by the end of 2000, let's say by the beginning of 2000, according to Thomas D. Kauser, very important scholar in disability life writing studies, he says that as much as 100 autobiographies have been written by disabled people in the West. But in India, it just sort of emerging. Even today, it just sort of roughly, disability studies in India is just roughly 10 years old. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. And Dr. Govind has one more question. He feels that the state must initiate a politically compulsive course of unwinding and unlearning the traditionally imbibed lessons, leading to the attainment of the long-term goal of social institutions and individual sensibility to accommodate disability as normal. Would you comment on this, sir?
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. The state has to initiate. Moreover, the universities should be willing to offer a course, right? I still remember when the undergraduate course was proposed in Delhi University, there was a lot of resistance from faculty members. Why should we teach disability studies? Right? So when Dalit literature course was introduced, nobody resisted, nobody objected to it. But why? Why when when women's studies course was introduced, nobody objected to it. So similarly, like many like the universities have been asked to start a center for women's studies. And Center for Social Inclusion and Inclusive Studies. Similarly, Center for Disability Studies should also be, started in universities. So we have some of the law universities there. I think Nalsar has a Center for Disability Studies. Gujarat National Law University has Center for Disability Studies. Delhi University just started the Center for Disability Studies, but the courses are not yet actually offered. But slowly, faculty members here and there, they're actually introducing course in disability studies. First of all, given the choice, we as faculty members should be able to sort of come up with a good course for disability studies, either in the bachelor level or in the master level. Number one. Number two, if it is not possible, at least in Indian literature, whenever we revise the syllabus, we should sort of somehow push in one or two texts by the disabled people, right? Let's say if you're teaching American literature, what's wrong in keeping one text by the disabled person? If you're teaching Indian writing in English, what's wrong in keeping one text by the disabled person? So similarly, this sort of accommodation has to be done from our end, we as faculty members. I understand we are actually sort of grappling with a large institutional barrier, right? So the institution will keep on push us to the margin, will keep on tell us that these courses do not deserve in universities. But we should also convince the people that this is an epistemology that it has to be taught in universities as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. I think you have addressed all the questions raised by our participant, and now it is time to wind up, I think. So let me hand over the mic to Ms. Jayalakshmi. Thank you so much.
Yeah, welcome.
Hello, thank you, Nisha sir. Thank you very much, dear participants, for raising the queries. Thank you, Dr. Boopathi, for sharing your insightful perspectives. With this, we are moving on to the concluding session. Let me invite Asha Balasanathan to deliver the vote of thanks.